I want to welcome all of you to the Spring Aquatic Academy. I'm Jerry Schubel, the president of the Aquarium, and it's great to see all of you here this evening. This should be a very important and exciting course. Genetically modified organisms, genetically engineered crops, genetically modified crops, all mean the same thing, and for many, these are emotionally charged phrases. Our goal in this course is to let you hear from experts and hear their views on GMOs, the good, the bad, the ugly, the promise, the potential, any dangers, any benefits. And by the time the course is over, we hope that you will have answers to the questions that you will find in this little book. And we hope you'll take notes. And it may be that some of our speakers will have different perspectives on some of these questions. But that will be good. And as in all of our Aquatic Academy courses, we've gone to great lengths to bring you some of the best scientists on the topic under discussion. And at the present time, there's a very important study on genetically engineered crops, past experience, and future prospects that's being conducted by the National Research Council of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine. The National Academies were established by President Lincoln, and then President Wilson established the National Research Council to shorten the time between advances in understanding and the time the public could benefit from this increased understanding. These National Academy studies are among the best, the most highly regarded reports ever. And every person except for one in our last panel is either a member of that committee or was recommended by 2 or more members of that committee. So over the next 4 weeks, you have a lineup of some of the best stars in this field that you could find. We hope that you will take notes in these. We're going to ask you to hold your questions until after each speaker has spoken. There'll be time for discussion. You also will have a sheet in your packet. It's up to you if you want to fill this out. The idea is you would fill it out tonight, and then we would hand the same sheet out at the 4th and final class and see if any of you have changed your opinions of GMOs as a result of this class. So we're going to get started. Tonight we have our 2 speakers, and you will find their full bios in a document that each of you has. So I'm not going to read those bios. I'm only going to give their name and their title in the interest of time. So we'll have one speaker. We'll take a break of about 10 minutes at about 8 o'clock, and then we'll have the second speaker, and the evening will end about 9:15. Our first speaker is Dr. Alison Van Eenennaam, and she is, almost got it. She is at the University of California, Davis, and she's a cooperative extension specialist. Our second speaker is David Zilberman. He's a professor and holds the Robinson Chair at the University of California at Berkeley. Both of them have spoken about this topic many times around the world, and we're anxious to hear what they both have to say. So, Alison, please come up. I will turn this microphone off, and Alison's on.
I think we could. Thank you very much. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this topic. I have to set the stage for the next 4 weeks, and I want to give a little background. I'm a biologist, a geneticist by training, and my speaker after me is an economist. And so we come with very different sets of skills. And I think looking at the program of the lineup you've got just a fascinating group of speakers. I wish I could be here for the next 3 weeks as well, and I think the last evening looks particularly intriguing because you've got some really good people with different viewpoints, and so that always makes for interesting conversation. So my objective tonight is to try to just give you the basic outline of what GMOs are and where they're used in agriculture. I am actually an animal geneticist, and so although I'll touch on the plant uses, my skill is really in the animals, and I will focus a little bit on fish just because we're here, and it seemed like the logical thing to do. And then also discuss a little bit around the regulations of both plants and animals in genetic engineering, and then just finish up with labeling, just 3 slides. There's going to be a different speaker, I think on the third night, that's going to speak about labeling in depth. But this is obviously a very hot topic at the moment if you're following what's going on in Congress. And so I wanted to just put some thoughts in your head and also give you a little bit of homework to read before the labeling talk happens. So with that background, I would just like to say that I do not like the word genetically modified organism because I actually work in this field and I have no idea what it means. It's totally amorphous. It's a little bit like natural or sustainable. What is the definition? And so really, if I look at the breeding that we've done historically, we've been genetically modifying our plants and animals for centuries. And I think you could all agree that these dogs do not look like their ancestor, the wolf. And that's been done using conventional selection techniques where breeders have selected the animals they like to be parents of the next generation. And then you get an unusual collection of dogs that magically find owners that appear to be very much like them. And so that's genetic modification. That's not what we're here to talk about. And so I do want to just kind of differentiate that term because it just doesn't mean anything. What I'm going to use for the term of what we're talking about here tonight is genetic engineering. That very specifically discusses the techniques that we're probably all more concerned about here tonight. And the USDA's definition, and there's different definitions depending which organization you want to go from, and that's part of the problem. But basically the USDA's definition is the manipulation of genes by introducing DNA, which codes for genes, into the genome or the DNA of an organism using these techniques of modern molecular biology or recombinant DNA. And it's really this use of recombinant DNA technology that is the trigger for the differentiation in some people's minds about these products. And so what I think often is the thing that concerns people is you can take DNA from one species and in a laboratory using recombinant DNA techniques, you can move that DNA into the genome of another species, and then it gets into the genome of that species, and then it's inherited just like blue eyes are inherited by my kids. And so it's really that use of recombinant DNA technology that is the trigger. And unfortunately, it's really a breeding method, but it gets called many different things. Genetically modified, GMO, transgenic, living modified organism, LMO, bioengineered, biotech, made with modern biotechnology, and my favorite, frankenfood. And so I can usually tell where people are coming from based on which literature they've been reading as to what they call it. And so the industry has historically used the term biotech, which again doesn't really mean anything. And the groups opposed to it typically use something a little bit less pleasant sounding, and often frankenfood. And I want to set it in the context, and I think this is a really important point. It is a breeding method. It's a way to bring novel genetic variation from one species into another, which is really something that breeders have done historically. And this is crops, but I could put something analogous up for animals. And it puts up some different breeding methods that we've historically used in crop production and crop breeding. And just if you think about the importance of breeding in the overall sustainability of agriculture, if we hadn't had the breeding improvements that we've had, for example, I'll take dairy cattle just because it's an area I work in. Dairy cattle of the 1950s versus dairy cattle of today have been improved through just conventional breeding and specifically artificial insemination with very high genetic bulls. Basically, we currently have around 9 million dairy cows in the United States producing all of our dairy milk products. If we had stayed at the level of productivity in the 1950s that we had for dairy cattle, and we were trying to provide the same amount of milk as what we provide with our 9 million cattle today, we would need 40 million dairy cattle in the United States to provide the same amount of milk. And so basically, if you think about that, we've had a 4-fold reduction in the number of animals we need to produce the amount of milk that we need in the United States. And there's analogous numbers that you can do for crops. And so what that really means is that you reduce the environmental footprint of a pound of meat or a glass of milk or a kilogram of corn or wheat and soy as a result of these improvements in genetics. And so I would argue that genetics is a really important kind of overall component of sustainability, because the more yield you can get per acre or per animal, the less acres you need to produce the food supply that we eat. And so the less productive an animal or an acre is, the more animals you need or the more acres you need to produce the same amount of product. And so it's a really important overall concept, because things like crossbreeding and things like radiation mutagenesis have been used in breeding. And basically what we're doing with crossbreeding is we're crossing 2 sexually compatible species to create a variety that has the desired traits of the 2 parents. When we're talking about mutagenesis, that's a technique that's been used a lot in plant breeding, where the plants will actually be exposed to some sort of a mutagen. It might be radiation. And what that does is it creates random mutations in the DNA of those plants. And then breeders will go out and they'll look and see if the plants have novel genetic variation that they would like to use in their breeding program. So have they actually caused a mutation that, for example, gives the plants resistance to disease, or maybe improved yield, or something that they're trying to select for in their breeding programs. And the targets of breeding programs are over there on the right. And basically these different methods are used to try to develop traits that are useful in our plants and animals. Things like disease resistance, pest tolerance, insect protection, drought tolerance, nutrient fortification, increased shelf life, improved taste for the consumer, herbicide tolerance, and increased production. And you can use radiation mutagenesis to give you those traits. In fact, there are some herbicide tolerant crops that have been developed using radiation mutagenesis that are tolerant to certain herbicides, because they've had a mutation that enables that plant to withstand the use of those herbicides. There's also things that are done like protoplast fusion, where cells come together to transfer traits between species, and that's done with various plants that are not sexually compatible. Things like polyploidy is done, for example, in watermelon. It's also done quite a lot in aquaculture, where you're doubling the number of chromosomes. So we're typically diploid. We get half from mum and half from dad. The sperm and the egg come together and we're diploid. If you actually stop the cells from the chromosomes from dividing, you can create triploid and tetraploid species using various chemical approaches, and that has some useful traits in terms of potentially giving the plant sterility, or actually if you make them tetraploid, then it can improve yield. And then there's also the newer techniques at the bottom, which are more using recombinant DNA technology. And so I put that up there because a lot of the techniques we use in conventional breeding, in the absence of understanding that they're used, also are not natural, I guess, if you want to use that word, but they're also quite sophisticated. They're often done in a laboratory. They often introduce random mutations where the breeder really has no control over what variation comes in when you do something like mutagenesis. And then the two at the bottom are ones that are using recombinant DNA technology. And the one on the far left is a new technology that you may have heard a lot about in the news lately. It's called genome editing, so CRISPRs. You may have heard a lot about that particular technology. There's other things, and basically what that does is it enables us to go in a very precise way and introduce a double-stranded break in a gene in a plant, and gives us some different options, but basically it's often used to turn off a gene. And so, for example, at Davis, we have some dairy cattle who normally grow horns, and they have to be manually removed by burning them off, is what is normally done with the dairy cattle in the United States. And we've gone in and turned off that gene that grows horns. And so those cattle are naturally what's called polled, they're hornless, so we don't need to actually manually remove those horns anymore. But that's not bringing in a gene from another species, it's just tweaking the DNA within that animal so it no longer produces that particular horns. And then finally, we've got transgenesis, and that usually and historically is what we've been talking about when we've been talking about genetic engineering, where we're bringing in DNA from another species because we have an attribute that we want to bring into our breeding program, typically that's not available in the species that we're working with. And so some of the classic examples are things like the Bt protein, which is an insecticidal protein that's been brought in from a soil microorganism into crops to make them insect protected against caterpillars. So that's an example of a transgenic crop and a genetically engineered crop. And so that's a little bit of background of some common crop breeding methods to kind of put it into perspective, as it's a tool that can be used to introduce useful variation into our breeding programs. And I'm just going to go through, this is the one we're talking about for the rest of the talk. And this is an example of one that has been around for about 20 years, and it's magically absent from almost all discussions around genetically engineered crops. And it's such a good story. It's kind of a shame to leave it out. So this is Dennis Gonzalez, who's at the University of Hawaii, and the University of Hawaii papayas have a disease that's called the ring spot virus, and you can see some affected organisms up here. And it was actually wiping out the papaya industry in Hawaii. And so Dennis Gonzalez, 25 years ago, basically used genetic engineering to bring in some DNA that basically inoculated those papayas so that they were no longer susceptible to the ring spot virus. It was done actually in collaboration with Cornell, and that made those plants disease resistant to the virus. It didn't do anything else to them. And so basically what that did is enable the farmers to then grow these products, and they don't have to use any pesticides to protect them from ring spot virus. And that has been a real success story that's now growing in Hawaii and basically saved that Hawaiian papaya industry. I'm going to talk about two other recent approvals. One is developed by a small company or small plant breeding company called Simplot, and that's the owner of that company, Scott Simplot. And this is basically a potato that has got a potato gene in it that has been used to turn off the enzyme that makes potatoes go brown when you expose them to air, as you see on the right. And so basically there's no transgene in this particular potato. It's got potato genes, and it stops it going brown, which is a food waste concern. About 30% of potatoes are lost due to that brown. And also it's a concern because it actually also results in higher levels of acrylamide when you cook potatoes and fry them. And acrylamide is a known carcinogen at high levels. And so that's a healthy, less food wasting potato that has recently been approved. And finally, an analogous thing was done in apples by this company called Okanagan Specialty Fruits, and you can see Neil Carter, who developed these apples. And again, there's a gene turned off in the apples, so they no longer produce the enzyme that makes apples go brown when you cut them and expose them to air. And so if you pack that in the kids' lunch in the morning, cut up for them, when they take it out, they don't go, ooh, yuck, it's all brown, I don't want to eat that. And so I put those examples up there because I think often the idea is that this technology is only the purview of large multinational corporations, and particularly Monsanto, and there are other applications, and I'll talk a little bit about why there's not more public sector applications coming out of the land-grant universities, and part of that is really due to the very expensive regulatory costs associated with the technology. And this last slide gives you some idea of the different public sector applications of this technology that's going on throughout the world. And so I've already discussed the rainbow papaya. There's also groups working on blight-resistant American chestnuts, oranges that are resistant to the citrus greening disease, which is a real problem in Florida. There's groups working on plums that are resistant to a virus, fungus-resistant strawberries. grape rootstock that's resistant to another virus. Are you guys seeing a trend here as to what breeders want to do if they have a chance? They want to try and breed disease-resistant plants and animals, and it's kind of a no-brainer. We lose a lot of our productivity to disease. If animals didn't get disease, it would basically improve the productivity of animal production about 20% globally. And so anything we can do to get disease-resistant varieties is really beneficial. And then there are also groups that are working to do things like alter the wheat so that it has a reduced glycemic index and for metabolic health for humans. And then there's a number of groups working on various biofortification products in things like eggplant, biocassava, and golden rice. And often these are philanthropic groups that are working with donor organizations to effectively make this product available to these developing countries where food security is an issue, and often food appropriateness of the nutrients is a concern as well. And so this is an example of the Biocassava Plus that's looking to increase various levels of nutrients in cassava, which is a really important vegetable in the developing worlds that this is being developed for in Nigeria. And so with that background then, that's kind of some of the stuff that's in development. And it's always intriguing to me that, we use genetic engineering a lot in many aspects of our life. And so if anyone here is a type 1 diabetic, the insulin that you use is developed by genetically engineered microorganisms. And we use it, for example, to separate curds and whey in cheese production. It's used a lot in medicine, veterinary and human medicine. And so many vaccines are recombinant DNA vaccines. And in those uses, it's not particularly controversial. But when you use the technology in food production, it seems to really cross a line, and there's a lot of controversy around the use of the technology. And so I want to just go over where it has been used in the most part globally. And this is a map of countries that allow the cultivation of genetically engineered crops globally in green. And what you can see there is the first crops were introduced in 1996. And so we're coming up on a 20-year anniversary, I guess. And the rise in hectares over time is on the y-axis. And what you can see that at the current time, we've got somewhere around about 18 million farmers globally now that are growing genetically engineered crops. And what's interesting is about 16.5 million of those are actually small-scale farmers in developing countries. And in fact, the acreage of planted crops in developing countries is more, it crossed over there in about 2011, in developing countries than it is in developed countries. And particularly insect-protected cotton in India and China is a really big use of the technology. And so there's 18 million farmers that are growing it. And so what sort of crops are these that they're growing? Well, what's been the impact of that first before we talk about what sort of crops? So in general, the crops that have been planted on those large acreage are two traits. They're either insect protected with the Bt protein that I mentioned a minute ago, or they're herbicide tolerant. And there you may have heard the glyphosate or the Roundup Ready crops, where a gene has been brought into the plant using genetic engineering that enables that crop to withstand being sprayed with a herbicide. So what that does is it enables the farmer to control the weeds, because when you spray the herbicide on the crop and the weeds die and the crop is protected. And that is basically a weed control mechanism. And so obviously if you plant Roundup Ready crops, you're going to use Roundup or glyphosate to treat those crops as a weed control mechanism. And I think what's important to think about in the context is what was being done for weed control prior to the introduction of Roundup Ready crops. And I think if you look at what the data says, they were still using herbicides. They were using selective herbicides, that is, selective herbicides that didn't kill the crop. And in general, those herbicides were more toxic and longer lasting than Roundup Ready. And that is why producers switched to the Roundup Ready, and it also enabled them to adopt no-till approaches where they could basically not have to till the land to take out weeds. They could rather use Roundup to take out the weeds, and so it really reduced the number of runs they had to do over the crops to control their weeds. Because weeds will happen. I don't care what production system it is, weeds will happen, and somehow you need to control the weeds. And so that was basically what the approach was. So on average, if you look at what the global meta-analysis is of the impact of the adoption of these crops, it's reduced chemical pesticide use by 37%. Now, that includes the reduction in insecticides, which is kind of an obvious thing associated with insect-protected plants. But there has been, of course, the use of glyphosate or Roundup in the crops that are Roundup ready. And so that overall is a 37% reduction. It's increased crop yields, basically because it protects the crops from weeds and insects. So if you protect your crop from pests, it increases the yield. So it's not that they've been necessarily intrinsically higher yielding, rather you've just protected them better from pests. And overall, it's increased farmer profits by 68%, and the next speaker will go into that in detail as to how that has come about, so I won't spend any time on that. But in general, the yield gains and pesticide reductions are larger for the BT or insect-protected crops than they have been for the herbicide-tolerant crops, where if you look at the data, sometimes it's had a big effect and sometimes it doesn't. It kind of depends on what your weed pressure is as to whether or not it has a big effect on the yield. And in general, the yield and profit gains are higher in developing countries where typically they haven't had insect control. And once you get insect control, then you have obviously improved yields because the insects aren't eating the crops. And it's also an issue there in terms of applying actual insecticides to crops, in terms of there's not good protective equipment. And so there's a documented impact on the health of those farmers who are now not having to use insecticides as a result of adopting those BT crops. So that's kind of the background of what the overall impact has been, and it'll depend on the crop and the country as to exactly what the benefits and who got those benefits are. And the next speaker will touch on that. So let's come to America. What crops in America are genetically engineered? Not very many. So if we look at that list, it's corn, it's cotton, it's soybeans, it's sugar plants, canola, papaya, some squash. They're virus-resistant squash. It's not all squash. That melons, sorry, I thought I corrected that. That should not be there. Sweet corn, potatoes I just mentioned, apples, and alfalfa hay, which is Roundup ready. So if you're not eating any of those, then they're not genetically engineered varieties. And I want to really draw attention to the fact that wheat is not a genetically engineered variety, because I'll often have people put up their hand at these meetings and say that they've got gluten intolerance because of the genetically engineered wheat. There is no genetically engineered wheat on the market, and so that's not genetically engineered wheats. And it's also, I think, important to look at, there's almost all fruits and vegetables and all nuts at the current time are not genetically engineered. And so there's only really, eight or so crops that have been genetically engineered, and part of that is due to the fact, as I'll mention later, that it's really hard to get these crops through regulatory, and that really puts up a hurdle to get some of the smaller acreage crops like strawberries or other small acreage crops, and particularly for the public sector to bring those products to market. And so there's a fair number of crops that have been developed that are sitting on the shelves at academic institutions that really have no path to market because there's just no capacity to kind of bring those products through. So, and this is just touches on in the United States, so that slide on the benefits globally was a global perspective. This is an example in corn as a result of adoption of insecticide or BT protected crops. There's been somewhere around about a 10-fold reduction in the insecticide use in corn as a result of insect-protected GE crops. And you'll notice every slide I put up has the reference where I've got this data from, and you can go check it out at your leisure. Of course, if we're talking herbicide crops, then you're going to have increased uses of glyphosate, but decreased uses of whatever herbicides were being used before to protect those crops from weeds. And what the actual impact would be will depend on the crop. So if you look at corn versus soy, it's a different impact, and it's complicated. And so there's no, they've increased, they've decreased. It's just difficult to say categorically yes, no, because it depends on the crop, it depends on what trait it is, and it depends on what sort of pest pressure they were under as to what the overall impact has been. And so the studies reflect that diversity as you would expect in agricultural production systems. And so during the introduction there was a discussion about the fact that the National Academy of Science is the premier scientific organization in the United States, and their most recent report, and as was mentioned, there's one that's kind of ongoing now, an update of what the impacts of the crops have been, summarised that the effect in general has been that the farmers in the United States growing biotech crops are realising substantial economic and environmental benefits, such as lower production costs, fewer pest problems, reduced use of pesticides, and better yields compared with conventional crops. And I guess as someone that works with farmers a lot, if a technology works, I've seen them adopt it, and if it doesn't, I've seen them not adopt it. And so that kind of makes sense because 18 million have adopted it, and so to me, that's evidence that there's some benefits to the farmers, and that's suggested by their adoption. So I want to touch on safety, and I think that this is a really interesting slide. The disconnect between what scientists think around the safety of this particular technology and the general public is the biggest gap between the scientists and the public of any of these relatively controversial scientific or politicized scientific topics. So there's a 51% spread between what the scientists think and what the general public thinks around the safety of genetically engineered foods. It's worse than vaccinations. How did we get such a disconnect? And that's really something that I spend a lot of my time trying to understand, because I think it's causing a lot of the public angst around this, and the data do not show that there's safety concerns with the current crops that have been approved. And so if you go to the internet, this is what you find, and very emotive, very fear-mongering kind of literature up there, suggesting all sorts of melodies that were going to come, especially a lot of infant pictures, I think playing on mother's guilt there. And I guess I looked to my friend Abraham Lincoln, who said, don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a quote next to it. And the reason that the majority of scientists think that this is a safe technology is because scientists let the data tell them what their opinion is going to be. And seriously, there is thousands of scientific papers that have looked at the crop safety. And this is a meta-analysis that was done last year, and it's available on the internet, and it summarizes over 1,783 scientific studies. And what you can see, and this is an independent group of scientists in Europe, nonetheless, and they said that the scientific evidence research conducted thus far has not detected any significant hazards directly connected with the use of genetically engineered crops. However, the debate is still intense. And I totally agree with that statement, but I think that there have been a lot of studies, and about half of those are independent studies that are not associated with the companies that are bringing the products to market. And as a scientist, that's very compelling evidence to me, but as I've worked with this topic for 10 years, I know that this is not a very compelling evidence to other people. And so I think that if you look at the leading scientific organizations, and again, the scientific organizations like the National Academy of Sciences or the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that's where scientists come together to get kind of a consensus viewpoint or the majority weight of evidence viewpoint around technologies. And it's groups of scientists, and it's not influenced by industry at all. And basically, if we look at the statements of these different organizations, they've all say that there are no unique risks associated with this particular breeding method. And of course, it depends on a case-by-case basis. So if I, for example, was a crazy megalomaniac and I brought in a toxin like, I don't know, botulism, into a crop, I could certainly make a dangerous GMO because the botulism toxin would be poison. But the crops that have been brought to market contain proteins that are not toxic and that are not allergenic. And so I think that the statements you see from the scientific organisations is the crops that have been brought to the market to date have not been associated with unique safety risks. And scientists are always cautious how they word that because you can't say blanket that it's safe or it's unsafe. It depends on the crop and it depends on the protein that you have in there. And if you look at the overall globally, it's not just United States organisations that say that, it's really every major scientific society in the globe. And for me, that is a statement that makes me comfortable that the science has been done and that there have been no unique risks associated with it. So I'm going to touch on regulations, and the reason I'm going to touch on that is because sometimes you'll hear statements that there's no regulations to bring these products to market, and that's very frustrating for me to hear that, because if there wasn't, then I think we'd see a lot more public sector products brought to market, and there haven't been. And the reason is that the use of recombinant DNA technology is associated with a regulatory pathway that differs between plants and animals, and this is the plant route to get to market if you have to, if you produce them using genetic engineering. And basically, all of the products that have gone to market have been reviewed by the FDA. That is technically a voluntary consultation, so you don't have to go through that consultation, but it always has been gone through by every product that's come to market, because I haven't seen a company yet that wants to risk bringing something to market without going through that FDA consultation. There's also a review by the EPA if, in fact, the crop is some type of a insecticidal or herbicide affecting crop, like BT, for example. And then they look at whether the crops are safe for the environment, and then the USDA looks at whether the crops are safe to grow. And on average, it takes about 13 years and $136 million to bring a crop through that particular process. And so that's part of, so if I develop a BT corn variety today, I've got that type of a time frame to get it approved through these regulations. And as the developer, it's my responsibility to do the studies that I submit to the agency, and the agency reviews those studies, as is true for other products that are developed. And so there is a process in place, and the USDA determines whether the crop is safe to grow based on its authority to regulate plant pests. That is it going to become a weed? Come on, computer. The FDA determines whether the crop is safe to eat. Is it differ in any way from its from the comparator, the non-genetically engineered conventional variety? And then the EPA regulates whether the crops have pesticidal properties. So are they safe for humans, non-target organisms, and for the environment? And so my friend, so if depending on what trait you've got, you're going to go through different agencies. So if I have insect resistance in a food crop, I'm going to have to go through FDA, USDA, and the EPA. If I have, for example, herbicide tolerance in an ornamental crop that's not going to be eaten, a rose, for example, or then it would just be USDA and possibly EPA if it's a new herbicidal use. If I'm modifying flower colour, blue poinsettias, then I'd only need to go through the USDA. So it's a little bit dependent on what the crop is and whether it's going to be used for food as to which particular agency it would have to go through. And if I was bringing a conventionally bred crop to market, I would go through the USDA, and I would get a variety registration on that crop, and I'd have to show that the crop grew according to what the agronomic performance is what was expected. I'd have to show what the breakdown of the composition of those particular crop was, whether it had any anti-nutritive factors, in other words, higher levels of proteins that are not desirable for nutrition, like you might get in potatoes, which has, I mean, plants are pretty evil, really. They try and kill anything that eats them. And so plant breeding, sometimes you elevate proteins that, you know, are pest resistant or toxic, and that's just natural. And so breeders need to keep an eye on that to make sure they don't do that. And they have to show it's distinct, uniform, and genetically stable. And my colleague, and I think he's speaking here on the last night, Alan McEwen, had this paperwork required for the registration of a conventional flax variety, and this is what the registration for a genetically engineered flax variety looks like, because there was a considerable amount of additional data that has to come through with a genetically engineered variety. And so all of that adds time and cost, and is kind of part of the reason that there's been very little public sector crops coming to market. And so I've seen a lot that it's said that the crops have not been evaluated by the FDA, and that's just flatly not correct. They've all been through the FDA voluntary consultation, and the FDA has found that all 158 transgenic gene crop combinations evaluated by the agency have been safe to eat, and similarly there have been regulators throughout the world that have similarly evaluated the regulatory packets in different countries for approval for consuming in Europe or Japan or Australia or New Zealand that have come to the same conclusion. And so these crops do have a fair degree of regulation associated with them. If you're interested, you can have a look at the FDA evaluation of all of these crops. There's a website there where you can type in what crop you're interested in and who made it and what trait it is, and you can have a look at all of the data that was used, and so that is all publicly available. One thing I did want to bring up just really quickly is, because this is my interest, is the fact that in fact the most common consumer of genetically engineered crops is our livestock populations. And so 70 to 90% of the crops are actually consumed by livestock. Corn, soy, alfalfa hay, that's what they eat. And they have been eating it globally for about 20 years, because we export a lot of animal feed into Europe from genetically engineered producing countries. And there's been a lot of animal feeding studies, hundreds of studies. This is just one example of a review that was done by a German researcher showing different studies done in different species of cattle or different species of animals, and basically showing there was no unintended effects in the composition, except in fact BT crops are protected from insects, and so they actually have lower levels of mycotoxin because they have less mold infestation. And there's been no significant differences seen in the health of the animals that have consumed these products for the last 20 years. And that's a really very large number of animals. If you think about the fact that in the United States, if you just look since 2000, from 2000 to 2011, we have somewhere in the vicinity of 9 billion broilers we eat every year. We have a pretty large number of beef cattle, dairy cows, hogs. If you do the math on that, it's about 105 billion animals that have been consuming genetically engineered feed since 2000, and obviously it came in a little bit before that. And we haven't seen unexpected trends in their health and as they've been consuming these crops. And so, you know, the science says that the crops are not different, and our field experience in feeding this to our animals haven't revealed any untoward trends also. So, and if the animals are eating genetically engineered crops, sometimes people ask me, does that affect their milk or meat or eggs? No. When they eat the feed, they digest the feed, they digest the proteins, they digest the DNA, and so the milk and meat and eggs from animals that have consumed genetically engineered crops is compositionally identical to animals that haven't eaten genetically engineered crops. So there's no DNA or protein that hangs on and is left over in those products. And so it's actually not possible to even test whether they have consumed genetically engineered feed, because there's nothing to test for in their milk, meat and eggs. And if you're interested, the CAST, which is the Council for Ag Science and Technology, has a freely available paper on this that talks about the meat, milk and eggs from animals that have consumed genetically engineered crops. So we're going to switch gears real quick here and move into actually genetically engineered animals, which is my area of expertise, and so the area that I think is really quite interesting. And there have been overall 5 approved products in the history of this technology. So there are 3 products that have been approved where animals are producing, they've moved a protein that produces a pharmaceutical product into an animal, and that animal is therefore producing that protein, and specifically in mammals in the milk of animals. So we've got goats that produce a protein that's used for a human therapeutic, and we've got rabbits that produce a protein that's used as a human therapeutic or drug. Now, those animals are not intended for the food supply. They're basically producing pharmaceutical products. And so those are not food supply. There's also a chicken that produces pharmaceutical products in its eggs. There's a pet glowfish, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, which is basically an aquarium fish that has moved a gene from jellyfish into the fish to make it fluoresce when you expose it to black light, kind of similar to the jellies up in the aquarium here. And then finally, there's the infamous AquAdvantage salmon, which I know you have a whole session on, and so I'm going to touch on that just briefly. But this is just an example. Very recently, the approval of the genetically engineered chicken that produces this pharmaceutical protein in the egg, because the egg is sterile, and it's a really useful production system for pharmaceutical proteins, because it's basically a little sterile package of protein, and if you can get the protein expressed in the white of the egg, it's a really useful way to produce those proteins. These are glowfish. I don't know if any of you have them in your aquariums at home. These are either danios, tetras, or striped barbs that obviously have different color fluorescence in them. And they are in about 10% of aquariums, home aquariums in the United States at the current time. And actually, I have some at home, and they kind of glow if you put them under a black light. They're actually pretty cool. And so there have also been some mosquitoes that are genetically engineered to try to reduce mosquito populations. Mosquitoes are a big carrier of disease. There was a company called Oxitec that's working to develop male mosquitoes that when they mate with female mosquitoes, the offspring of that mating are not viable. And the females are who bite you because they need the blood for their eggs. Males don't bite you. And this has become very topical because of the whole Zika concern. And so there's now a lot of discussion around whether this could be used as a biological control for that particular invasive and species to prevent the spread of Zika virus in Brazil. There's also some moth work being done with the diamondback moth using the same technology. Then we've got our friend, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, perhaps. This is a genetically engineered salmon, Atlantic salmon, that was produced by actually public sector researchers in Canada in 1989, where they brought a gene from the Chinook salmon into the genome of the Atlantic salmon. That was micro-injected into the egg, and it got into the DNA, it integrated into the DNA. And since that time, it's been inherited from generation to generation to generation, just in normal sexual reproduction way. So there's no, I often see pictures of syringes in tomatoes, insulin syringes, surprisingly, which we never use in a lab. I'm not sure if they have diabetes or what the problem is, but there's no syringes involved. It's just passed on sexually from generation to generation. So, and basically it grows faster. And the proposal from the company is to actually grow these fish in contained inland facilities. And this is a picture of the facility where they're proposing to grow these animals. These are going to be Atlantic salmon that are triploid, and they're also all female, and the triploidy makes them sterile. And they're also obviously contained inland. And they basically are able to get to market weight in somewhere around about 16 to 18 months, instead of the usual 30 months it takes for Atlantic salmon to get to market weight. And obviously, if you're a producer, that's an advantage, because fish feed is about 70% of your costs of production. And if you can bring the animal to market, it's obviously in a shorter amount of time, then it's beneficial for you, and it also requires less feed. And so it has somewhere around about a 20% improvement in the amount of feed required to get a pound of gain, so pound of feed to pound of gain. And I'm sure that Ron Stodish, who's coming from AquaBounty, is going to speak in great detail more about that. And I guess what I wanted to touch on is the regulations around animals, because this is really, again, precluding public sector breeders like myself from using this technology. So I mentioned that the founder fish was created in 1989. They started an FDA review of the salmon, and in the case of genetically engineered salmon or animals, they're regulated mandatorily by the FDA. So it's no longer a voluntary consultation, it's a mandatory consultation. And they're regulated strangely as a new animal drug. And the rationale behind that is a little strange. It's that FDA regulates things that change the form or function of an animal. And this protein is a growth hormone, makes the fish grow more rapidly. So that's changing the function of the animal. So therefore, the protein is a drug. Okay, so that's basically how it comes under the FDA. So they started their regulatory studies back in 2001, finished all of their regulatory studies showing that the flesh was safe to eat, that the fish grew more rapidly, that the fish was in good health, safe for the environment with the containment that they were proposing in the on-land tanks, sterile females. And then they finally had a veterinary medicine advisory committee meeting in 2010. And then there was about a 5-year hiatus where there was a lot of political efforts to try to defund the FDA from evaluating the fish and to prevent them from coming to market. And then finally in 2015, there was the approval in November of last year. But now actually they're held up as a result of a rider on the current budget bill in the federal government until such time as the FDA comes up with a mandatory labeling approach for the fish. And additionally, there's a whole group of activist lawsuits that are threatening lawsuits if the product does get approved. And I guess to me, I want to just put to you this idea that, you know, if you look at animal breeding, what we routinely select for, this thing is not working. What is that? Whoa. Sorry. Can you go to the next slide, please? This is just not working. Thank you. This is chickens, conventionally bred selected chickens, no genetically engineered chickens here. This is 1957 genetics, and this is 2001 genetics at days 43, 57, 71, and 85 under the same environmental conditions. This is what 50 years of selection in chickens has done. Basically, we're selecting for fast growth. They grow about 4 times faster due to genetic selection. It's not uncommon for animal breeders to select for fast-growing animals. That's pretty much a trait that makes a lot of sense from a sustainability perspective. And if we hadn't done this, we currently eat 9 billion chickens a year. If it hadn't been for that, we'd need to grow an additional 9 billion to get the same amount of product that we're getting from these genetically improved chicken lines. And next slide, please. If we compare, then, we've got these breeding technologies that have no regulation, basically. You can go to market with these fast-growing chickens as we have since animal breeding started. But if you use this one breeding method called genetic engineering, then you have a 20-year regulatory process and an $85 million or so tab associated with the development of that fast-growing fish. And scientifically, that doesn't make a lot of sense, and definitely from an innovation perspective, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because basically that says you will not use this breeding method in your breeding program. And as a public sector breeder, I can tell you that the University of California, Davis doesn't have $85 million sitting in the back pocket to bring these products to market. And so when people are worried about only large multinational companies having ability to use this technology, part of the problem is the fact this innovation block to bring the products to market due to the regulatory process associated with it. And so I'm going to stop there because I want to give a little bit of time for questions, and so I'll open up the floor to questions. Yes, you went first.
So I don't know anything about this. When you talk about natural breeding, as opposed to genetically engineered breeding, are there either limitations or restrictions that breeders face in natural breeding that are more easily overcome in genetically engineering because you're directly manipulating the genetics?
Yes. So the real advantage of genetic engineering to me is when you can actually bring in traits or characteristics or genes that you can't access in your population that brings in a novel trait. So for example, in the papaya, you can bring in the DNA that gives it resistance to that virus. You can't breed the papaya to have that DNA in there. And so there's no way to access that genetic variation. And so to me, that's where the real value is. It gives you access to these traits that there's no way you could bring it in using natural breeding. In other words, there's no sexually compatible partner that you could bring that genetic variation in from. And so that's really the power of it, yes, you can bring in this useful genetic variation. I think you were next.
Thank you. Okay, so I have so many questions.
Uh-oh.
So I'm going to put my glasses on.
Pick your best one.
Oh, my best one. Okay. Let's see, obesity, cancer, heart disease are on the rise. I'm concerned about browning, the enzymes that brown apples. Maybe those enzymes play some role in the spectrum of good that apple ultimately brings to whomever eats it.
So it's interesting. So do you know, have you ever seen golden sultanas? Do you know what golden raisins?
Yes.
Golden. So that's a naturally occurring mutation in the gene that makes raisins go brown. And that occurred through just normal mutation. It wasn't introduced using genetic engineering. And so that is a product that we've been consuming safely. And so I think that we do have some history actually with those types of products.
But you use the word mutation.
Yep.
I don't know if you can use the word mutation and natural occurring. It's not a mutation, it's naturally occurring.
Right, it's a naturally, well, in that case, it was a naturally occurring mutation. Mutation, it has
a different connotation. I don't believe it applies to something that's naturally occurring.
Oh my gosh, yeah, no, mutation is how evolution happens, right? So mutations are, basic, the genetic variation that differs between all of us is due to mutations. So over time, you collect mutations from just naturally occurring errors in DNA replication, and that's basically what makes all the differences between us. And natural selection will say, oh, you're fitter because you got a mutation that makes you somehow more reproductively successful, and it will select for that. And that's basically the basis of natural variation. And so the term mutation, although it sounds really dodgy, is actually really, it's a naturally occurring process. And so what the company that made the apple did was actually just stop that gene from expressing, and so it doesn't go brown. And as I mentioned, that can happen using naturally as well, and it has in the case of sultanas. And so absolutely they look at the safety of that food. Does that enzyme not being there affect it in some way from a food safety perspective? And they do those analyses, and that's part of bringing those products to market. Did that answer your question?
Yes, but it's really not a matter of safety. Is that enzyme important to the microbes in our stomach, feed them in a certain way? And that in itself is kind of a new science right now. We're discovering like the microbes in our stomach are the source of our immune system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd have to have a biological hypothesis, and you could test that hypothesis if an apple that didn't brown was going to, I guess it'd be, you'd eat an apple right away and then maybe cut one and then eat it 2 hours later and when it's all brown, and then see if there's a difference in the microbes and if that's an important difference. But I don't know that there's any suggestion that the browning of an apple, you should eat browned apples rather than fresh apples.
The point is we really don't know what this can do. I mean, it's just a small example.
Yeah, I guess you could say that about pretty much anything. And so I guess what I like to see is some type of a biologically plausible mechanism why that might be, an important thing. And that's part of the safety evaluation that they do at the FDA. Okay. Okay. All right.
Getting to your last point about the $85 million and 20 years to wait to get a GMO to market, do you have any information on countries like China that has a large population they need to feed and probably not that much regulation?
I do have a fair bit of information on China because they've invested very heavily in this technology. But interestingly, and I do believe this, they haven't brought these products to market yet. Globally, they were kind of waiting to see what the FDA was going to do regarding the fish I think, and globally, you know, I kept getting asked what's going on with the fish, and it's like, I don't know, it's just on hiatus. I think that it's likely they'll use it. They do have a regulatory system in place, and in fact, Brazil, Argentina, and China are very aggressively using this technology, and I think they will bring products to market. And maybe it makes sense to do it in areas where you have, you know, huge feed demand. You know, we're very lucky here. We've got enough food for America, and maybe it makes sense to adopt it in countries where there is that demand. But I think that the Chinese government certainly put a lot of money into the developing of all these techniques. And to me, I think what they're doing is they're getting their scientists up to speed, and then when they pull the switch, you know, they'll bring a lot of products to market. But they do have a regulatory system in place.
You mentioned in BT corn, you talked about it a lot, and I know back in the 90s the government said, yeah, you can grow it, but it can't be for human consumption. And then mysteriously or magically, boom, it ended up in our food supply.
No, I don't think that's correct. So there was one example about 15 years ago that was Starlink, that was only approved for animal feed. That's the only example I know where there was what's called a split approval. Every other approval, to my knowledge, has been both food and feed. And the Starlink actually eventually did get approved for food, but it had the issue where it was actually in the food before it had been approved, and that's what caused that whole controversy. But there was no... Well, so after that happened, there's never been allowed, split approvals are no longer allowed, they have to be approved for food. And so, as I mentioned, all of the products that are currently on the market have all been approved for food by the FDA, and so there's no product that's currently being sold that hasn't been approved for food.
Alison, thank you very much.
Okay.
Take a 10-minute break. If you need a restroom, you go out and go to the left. Maybe, I don't know. If we could have everyone come back in and have a seat, please. And we'll give Alison a break. Don't forget to pick up a piece of papaya on the way in. And we're going to do a test, and we're going to see how many of you are still able to come back next week. So, Alvin, that was super.
Okay,
that
was that
really
good?
super.
Okay, all right.
Yes. All right. So you're wired up, are you? All right. So our next speaker is David Zilberman, and you have his bio, and he will talk until about 9 o'clock. There's the clock. And then we'll have some Q&A for 10 or 15 minutes. So, David, it's all yours.
Okay, guys, thanks. Okay, I'm an agricultural economist, and I've been working on issues of GMO for about 25 years. I'm originally from Israel. That's the reason for my accent. I hope that within the next 45 minutes, most of you will get it. Anyhow, so basically what I like to do is to speak about GMO from an economic perspective. I was on this NRC committee that evaluated GMO in 2010. And to me, GMO came as a topic of research, and I realized that it's became to some extent a cause because, as I will argue later on, not taking advantage of it is very dangerous for us and society and to the future of the planet. Okay, so it's based on several studies that I wrote. And a lot of the stuff that I cover in the beginning came from Alison, but I will make some basic points that I explain to my students that they generally don't know a lot about science. So what is a genetic modified organism? Genetic modified organism is applying technique of molecular biology to change and modified crop. Everything that we eat is modified. Basically, agriculture is about taking wild species and domesticating them. And in the past, it was done in very, very crude methods. It wasn't precise. We were guessing. It was basically learn from your mistake. GMO basically is a technique where you use precise science to know what you're doing. To me, the best analog to GMO is electronics. GMO for biology is what electronics is to physics. You understand exactly what's going on in the cell, and you modify it accordingly rather than guess. And by being precise, you save energy and you have better results. So that is the first thing. GMO is much more precise by definition than a lot of techniques that irradiate apple and hope for the best. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that GMO is not owned by Monsanto. Everyone said it's a great technology, but it's owned by these terrible people. They're not terrible, but let's assume that they are terrible. It's not owned by Monsanto. It was mostly invented by universities, and Monsanto has some patent. But these patents are expired. There are ways to go around the patent. The issue that a company owns everything is not so bad. I have this thing that is the iPhone. I don't know, some of you have it. It's owned by a company that is much, much worse than Monsanto in terms of its practices. It has a nice organic name, Apple, but they have the most profit in the world. They are richer than most countries. They didn't do it because they were generous to their customer, including me, but we buy the stuff. So to me, and even poor people buy it. So to me, the fact it's not owned by Monsanto, and if it would have been owned by Monsanto, so what? Now, how dangerous it is. Every scientific body that I know couldn't find anything wrong with it. Now, I tell you, I am a scientist, and in science, you basically get your brownie points by going against the trend. If someone would find a real good reason why GMO sucks, this guy will be a hero. I know people in EPA, their mission is to find something wrong, and then they become heroes. I'll give you an example. There was a guy that about 20 years ago discovered that when you have a high level of sulfur in the atmosphere, it reduced children IQ. Reagan was a president, not the most environmentally conscious guy. The moment that they showed it to him, he basically disallow leaded gasoline. So someone discovered that lead is not good for your health, it reduced children IQ, Reagan banned lead. So to me, the reason that you have scientists at the government is to find that things don't work. So the fact that after 20 years you didn't have anyone that come with a reasonable finding against GMO tell you that the thing is not so bad. Of course, there will be traits that may have problems, but the method is more precise method than anything I know about in biology. Now, another thing. Generally speaking, biologists are divided to two groups, people that are molecular and organismal. The most famous organismal biologist is E.O. Wilson. Now, the organismal biologists, they are people that worry about ecology, and they are the people that generally are against GMO. He is the greatest, and he said, "Gosh, we have no chance to survive climate change, billions of people, and save the environment without taking advantage of science." GMO is the most advanced science. Thirdly, which I think is very important, people all the time said, "Oh, today we have so many cancers." There is one thing that is unfortunate. People tend to die. The only thing, they die much later than in the past. Every year, life expectancy goes up by 3 months. That's a lot. My mother-in-law passed away when she was 94. My grandmother passed away when she was 60. I'm sure that it's true with many of us. I'm now 68. For 30 years ago, again, if I was 30 years ago at 68, I probably wouldn't be here. So my feeling is that whatever people say about how irresponsible scientists are and how terrible they are, their track record is not that bad. So if you start to say, guys, let's forget about the scientists because I read in National Enquirer that there is a person in Iowa that got a radioactive pimple, the moment that we give up on science, we give up on anything. Okay, now, I can go on and on. You saw this picture from by Alison, so I would like to speak a little bit about the GM trait and a little bit about the economics. There are 3 generations of GM trait. The first generation are traits that are basically controlling against plant diseases. And people say, why do we care about plant diseases? The most important science in many ways is medicine. It's about diseases. You have human diseases and plant diseases. The main challenge in agriculture is to keep plants healthy. In the US, we have 10 times higher yield than in Ghana or in Africa. They have as good soil that we have. Why? Because we are able to control of diseases and we manage plants very well. Now, what happens if you have more land, more output per acre? You need less acres. You know that today we grow on less land, that we use less land than we used in 1918. Now we use about 300 million acres. In 1918, we used 400 million acres. That is because of things like GMO. So if you really, now what happens if you don't have enough food? That you have deforestation. If you have enough food, you start having national forests. We have a program called Conservation Reserve Program, where you take land out of agriculture and you make a lot of reserves. And you plant a lot of trees and do a lot of nice environmental items. I was one of the people that work on designing this program. Why do you have it? Because the price of food becomes cheap, and we say we don't need that land, so now let's give it to the environment. So my feeling is that even from an environmental perspective, these plant disease control traits are important. The second are traits that enhance the quality of food, the nutritional intake of food, drought tolerance of food. and make the food better in terms of quality and in terms of ability to be in the environment. And the third generation are more new type of pharmaceutical that will be grown on food. Plants are chemical laboratories, and they are much cheaper than the machinery that we have. And I believe that in the long run, you will have a lot of plants that will be producing a lot of medicine. Like you remember, even when people were speaking of some of the most recent diseases that we have, they thought about growing them in plants. It's not that it will be the same plant that you eat in the supermarket. You wouldn't come to Safeway and you have aspirin. But in principle, you would use plant in a way that it would be good for the environment and good for people. Now, so generally speaking, most of the stuff that we use is second generation, but we have something called pre-tri. We have a lot of traits that are second and third generation. And to me, GMO, it's not GMO, all the transgenic, now there is something called gene editing, all these techniques allow scientists to develop better capacity to use what we know and to produce more with less. That's the reason that almost every scientist that I know try to use this technique to solve problems because they save time, the same resources. If you worry about climate change and you have to adjust to climate change, you want to have a fast adjustment. I don't believe that if you use organic farming or ecological farming, many of you, it sounds great, ecological farming, but that's what people did for 40,000 years. And we could have in ecological farming or organic farming feed 7 billion people. So if you say, good, that's fantastic, we have to find a way. The only way to do is to decide about 3 billion people that don't belong here. I don't know the answer. Okay, so now let's look at the impact of GM. Generally speaking, that's the way I entered to the area. People were asking me, what is the impact? How you look at the impact of GM on productivity? So I said, if you look at the output of every plant, there is something that I call potential output and damage. And what GM does, it reduces the damage. So basically, if the potential output is 10 ton and you have 4 ton damage because of insect and GM reduce the damage to 1 ton, then instead of having 6 ton, you have 9 ton. It's clear? So generally speaking, where would you have most damage? You will have most damage in countries that have a lot of insect and they don't have chemical pesticide. So a lot of the new traits will be much more effective in countries that have a lot of developing countries that are humid. They have a lot of pests and not a lot of pesticide. So in the beginning, when GM came, in the US, the yield effect was relatively low. Why? Because we have chemical pesticide. So a lot of people that anti-GM said, oh gosh, it doesn't increase, it doesn't affect yield. So I sent a student to India, and then the yield went up with GM by 60 to 70%. Not every place, but at certain areas. So it's quite clear that the yield effect of GM can be very high when you have a lot of disease problem. Not everywhere. Like, if you are not sick, medicine doesn't make you better off. Generally, medicine helps you when you are sick. The same thing, GM helps you when you have a problem. But it can have a significant yield effect, and when you take it, you don't use chemical pesticide. Now, now one of the key elements is these two concepts, intensive versus extensive margin. Sounds complex, but it's very, very simple. GM, a lot of time, increase the yield in area where you grow a certain crop, but also allow you to grow crop where you didn't grow it before. This is called extensive margin. I'll give you an example. California, before people developed the Central Valley Project and a lot of water projects, didn't grow anything. Now California probably is the most productive region on Earth, and we are one of the best places in growing organic farming. Now, why do we grow organic farming in California? because we have unique varieties or because we are very smart. That's one thing. Because we basically are growing a lot of agricultural product in a desert. We take water, we irrigate the desert. The desert doesn't have a lot of pests. It's cold at night. The desert does the work of pesticide. So in California, we don't need that much pesticide. So if I will be a California farmer, I will say, you should only buy organic. And you in Mexico or in Illinois or North Carolina, you are idiot because you are not environmentally aware. And I sell my stuff in all food, and you can sell your stuff in Safeway, which is really terrible. But the reality is that this is only propaganda. And to some extent, a lot of time when you have a new technology like irrigation or GM, it allows you to expand the area where you grow some crops. So one of the things I try to do is to try to look, this is a graph, where do people, how much of the adoption of GM is the intensive margin, namely using it on existing land and in extra land. So I look at what happened to cotton. So what you see is that the acreage of cotton actually declined over the last 20 years. You see that about 40% of the cotton acreage is switching to GM, and then we have new areas that grow cotton. These are areas that are very productive in India, in China especially, that couldn't grow cotton before because of diseases. And now they can grow cotton because they have BT and they don't need to worry about diseases. On the other hand, in the US, you have less cotton. Why? Because we don't benefit a lot of GMs. The price of cotton went down and people moved to other crops. That would allow us to reduce the price of corn. Now let's look at China. You see it in China, a lot of the, and you see in India, 90% of the farmers in India are using GM cotton. Now, why this is important? First, it's really helped the Indian farmer a lot in terms of the income. And secondly, it shows you that generally poor farmers can adopt the technology. You cannot say that GM is only used by Stuart Resnick, which is the biggest farmer in California. It's used by a little guy that have a quarter of an acre, he has what we call a garden, in India. It's used by many farmers. So it's a technology that is used by small farmers. Because basically a seed is a seed. It's a little bit better seed. It doesn't need a lot of equipment, so it makes your life easier. Now, soybean to me is the biggest success story of GM. Now, why soybean is important? You can see the acreage of soybean is growing. Because as population is growing, as population become rich, they like to eat more meat. Now, again, some people will say, gosh, we should be all vegetarian and save the planet. That's very nice. I don't know, man. I know some people that are vegetarian. It's a very nice lifestyle, but you cannot force everybody to do it. Some people like meat. Most people I know. You know, so the basic point is that suddenly you need incredible amount of soybean. And what happened, people adopted Roundup Ready soybean and some other varieties of soybean, and you can almost see that 2/3 of the people in the acreage in the world is with soybean. In the US, you have incredible use of soybean that about mostly on existing land. But what it allows you to move to something that is called no-tillage, that you don't use, that you don't plow the fields, and you reduce the greenhouse emission of soybean in agriculture. Later on, I showed that the impact is really big. So it's much better environmentally than the system before. Now, in Brazil, you have a lot of soybean, but the most interesting thing in Argentina, 100%. But you know what happened in Argentina? Because of GM, people now use double cropping. Namely, they grow wheat and then they grow soybean. And by doing it, they use the same land twice. So they basically have double cropping on the same amount of land. So to some extent, the agricultural land in Argentina didn't grow very much while they get double the yield. The idea of double cropping is very sound environmentally because the number one issue from an environmental perspective, you don't want to take land to expand agricultural land because that's the time that you destroy tropical forest etc., etc., etc. If you use the land several times, you can get much more out of it. Now, for example, I don't know how many of you know about India. India has probably 1.3 billion, it's a huge number of people. They have terrible land. They don't have a lot of land and it's not that good. How they are able to feed their people? They use the same field 3 times. They grow crops that have short life and they grow three yields per year, okay? GM allow you to get double cropping in Argentina. Now people speak about what will be a future of agriculture in the US, and I predict, and I spoke with a lot of scientists, that with climate change and with new technologies, you will see double cropping even in the Midwest. Now we have 20% double cropping in the Midwest, and you basically will need less land to grow more food. And basically Roundup Ready basically allow this in Argentina. Now, what happened in maize is really interesting. The main adopter of GM maize is the United States. And basically what really is happening is that our yields that were always big are become bigger. Now, generally speaking, Europe had higher yield, some countries like Italy had higher yield on corn than us. Now we have higher yield than them because of GMs. Their yield didn't go up. And basically what happened is that the increase in the yield of cotton because of GM basically allow us to weather some of the tension and pressure that was caused by start using biofuels. So to some extent, already in these 3 crops, we have a lot of significant effect in terms of productivity and in terms of loss of pesticide. I use this type of model. I only want to show you that it's not that I invented it. And we basically estimate the impact of GM on productivity, but I will give you about some of the other effects. First, the effects vary. The first thing is it increases worker safety because you use less chemicals. It allows you a lot of flexibility because you know that you have a control against the pest rather than you all the time have to check what's going on. And it also reduces effort. Now people say, God, this is terrible to reduce effort. Why shouldn't farmers work harder? See, the point is a lot of my friends suggest that what farmers will do, they will monitor insects, called biological control, which is a nice idea. But basically, I don't like to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to count bugs. Why would someone else would like it? So in the US, we have systems that are professional, that do it, people get paid for it, but to some extent, GM allow you to have systems that are a little bit easier, and I don't see what's so bad with it. But altogether, what we try to do, we'll try to look what is the increase in impact of GM on overall supply, as well as what is the impact on prices. So you can see that on corn, it's increased supply by 10%, cotton by about 17, and soybean 30. But look at the reduction on the price. You say, okay, why would I care that the price of soybean went down that much? For most of you, that doesn't really matter. Most of them, basically, in America, food, about 5–10% of the expenditure. And the audience here, I don't speak about what you pay for an expensive restaurant that go to the chef and the rent. But if you look at the stuff that you buy, raw fruit and vegetables cost nothing. But if you're in a developing country, if you are in Haiti, if you are in Africa, if you are in Mexico, even if you are a poor American, it really matters. And we have a proof. You remember what happened in 2008, there was a little shorter in grain. We have food riots. So GM prevented food riots that were much worse than what we have before, because China, the population in China got richer and became bigger. They would have continued to import corn. And then the poorer country would have suffered. And the country that the government is not really caring that much for the poor would have suffered. So to some extent already, the basic point I want to make, GM already had a huge and positive social effect. Now, again, That's the point I raised before. Most of the adoption of GM is by small farmers, so to say that this is a corporate technology is wrong. Now, there are a lot of examples in India that show how the poor benefited from GM, but this result relates to something else. A lot of time people say, God, why would we care about GM? The profit goes to Monsanto. What we really looked at is we analyzed how the gain from GM are distributed. And you see that they are divided between the farmer, Monsanto, and the consumer. Over time, the bigger gainer become who? The consumer. Because the more GM you have, the lower the price and the consumer benefit. So in the beginning, Monsanto got maybe 60%. Now Monsanto gets maybe 20%. And the consumer may get more than 60% of it. Now, this is an interesting story. You can see that the increase in supply in Argentina was exactly parallel to the increase in demand in China. So without the increase in supply of soybean in Argentina that was GM related, we would have a big problem. Where would China would gotten their soybean? That would be a big political issue. Now, as I said before, GM has a lot of environmental benefit already. You have no tillage, you save land, you save chemicals because you have higher production. And we figure out that if I look at the greenhouse gas saving from GM, it's about 1/6 of the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted by US farmers every year, by US automobiles every year. So it's a significant amount. So I said before, when we move. Now, another issue that we spoke about is the biodiversity. People say, oh, if you move to GM, you will have monoculture. GM is a trait. You can insert this trait to every variety around. Actually, you can have more trait because you can revive old variety. In the same way that people revive old goat and unicorns or whatever, you can basically do back to the future. Because the more you know about genetics, you go to Russia and you have a place called the Vavilov Institute with varieties from zillion years ago, and you can try to see how you can use them because suddenly you have solution to all the problem. My feeling is that today, the biggest development that we have is a genome. And you can identify a lot of traits and you can insert them. What prevents scientists from doing it is regulation and suspicion. But once you do it, you can really return to a lot of the past, okay? Now, as I said before, many countries don't adopt GM. Why? There are many, many reasons. And one, in my view, there are two main reasons. First is that the environmental movement has an instinct to be against anything new. It's called environmental defense, nature conservancy. And a lot of it is reasonable. Sometimes, like I don't like sometimes that you have development without limit. But on the other hand, they have a lot of times suspicion of science. But that is part of the story and not a big part of the story. In the beginning, when GM was introduced, it was an American technology that was very much threatening an industry that was dominated by Europe, which is the chemical pesticide industry. And they say, we will support the environmentalists for a little bit till the patent expires. In the meantime, there was a momentum that was against it. There is another reason. Some farmers said, good, why should we have GM wheat? If you have GM wheat, the price of wheat will go down and we will suffer. Let's keep it the way that it is now. So to some extent, the suffering from the banning of GM, in my view, are the poor and the environment. Because when you don't have high variety, you increase your acreages. Now, but there are a lot of victims that are obvious. And one example is golden rice. Now, golden rice was developed by a person in Switzerland, and Petricus. And the basic idea is that about 500,000 people every year around the world get blind because they are not able, they have no access to vitamin A. So what he did, he developed a trait that increased the vitamin A content of rice. It's called golden rice. Now, one of the professors in Berkeley is a huge hero because he found a solution to river blindness. So generally, preventing blindness, it looks quite positively, not in the case of golden rice. So what happened is that you have this variety, it took several years till it became semi-decent. You couldn't do commercial testing. The regulators every year delay and make it more and more difficult and basically allow you only to do it to try it in one variety. So to some extent, a technology that could have happened about 10 or 15 years ago is still in limbo. The regulations are so difficult, and it's because of political pressure. Greenpeace, a lot of other environmental groups are really worried that if you will have this technology, then it will open the gates. Now I'll say something because only I remember it. Someone asked me, what about China? Someone asked this question, okay? Now, China basically invests incredibly in GM. And the thing about GM is they don't have the technology or the innovation that will be the breakthrough innovation. We are lucky. It's not everyone that can develop a good technology. Monsanto, it was luck and dedication. The moment that China have 2 or 3 big-time applications, they will use it. And to me, what happened is Europe is worried about China, and they worry about the competition in China. They basically lost the game. Germany lost the game. And if the US decide tomorrow to give up on GM to be politically correct and to look nice to the European because they are sophisticated, we would lose the game. That's exactly it, because China doesn't use GM not because of environmental awareness, because they don't have the science and the capabilities that we have. And with gene editing, I think that they will move very fast forward. So my feeling is, I'm really very blunt about it. My feeling is that it's not that they do it because they are so aware about the environment. If they were so aware of the environment, why would they pollute it with coal? And we are not so aware. They are not doing it because they don't have the capacity to do it as good as we do. They depend on Monsanto technology, but they try to develop their own approaches. So that's one reason that I think the politics are very important, and you don't need to be naive to think that it's only environment. It's a lot of it is political. And the US has an advantage in one area, and the reason that we have this advantage is because we really, compared to other countries, support our universities, and this is a university-based technology. No one, it's not Monsanto, it's the universities that sold the technology to Monsanto. We have a much better infrastructure of research and biology than any other country, and we have a good extension, and we were able to do it. Why throw this advantage away? Now, so basically, what happened with golden rice, I'm sorry that I jumped. What happened with golden rice is that basically every year people delay and delay and delay. So we start to look how much money and how many life years were lost because, not life years, eyesight years were lost because of this technology. Even if we assume very low level of adoption, all in all, you speak about something, you speak about order of magnitude of millions of people, millions of life eyesight were lost. You see the numbers. You have to add 3 zeros there. You speak about the numbers, 10 million, under different assumptions, you get huge numbers that were lost because people worry about environmental effects that no one has seen before. So basically, you give up sure benefit in order to gain some unsure risk that no one knows about. Clear? So the point is this is not my and your eyesight, it's poor people's eyesight. So when it comes to poor people's eyesight, it's okay to take a precautionary approach. Now, GMO, golden rice is not the only lost opportunity. To me, we have many other lost opportunities that are a result of regulation. For example, one of the big problems in Africa is the fact that banana, which is the main food in Uganda, has some virus. Some African scientists found a new variety that can solve it. It's not being introduced because of regulation and because of pressure from Europe. So basically, people now suffer because there is less food. So what we try to do is we basically try to look and say, what will happen if we would would eliminate many of the regulations? First, we can have many more traits. We can have soybean that will be much more efficient, that will produce more food and less waste. We could have you can have a lot of product with longer shelf life. We can have food that is, we can have a lot of food that has higher quality in terms of nutritional content. You can have much, even many no allergens. So to some extent, these are the traits that are not being used. And you can see the GM industry was moving this way. And instead, since 1997, when the European banned it, it's more or less flat. Now it went up a little bit. So ban basically kill industry. So if I'm an investor in America, what would I invest? In a science-based company like Mendel that develop new GM varieties that can save life, or in Twitter? So we have a lot of investment in all this new electronic stuff, Facebook, Twitter. I have nothing against it. They are great. But that's not the most essential part of life. We underinvest, the private sector underinvest in biology because of all this regulation. And to some extent, we all will pay for it. Now, so generally speaking, today it takes about $160 million to introduce new traits. So who can do it? Only big companies. So if big companies can do it, then you say, oh, that is controlled by some monopolies. Reduce the regulation, and you can reduce the regulation without eliminating the regulation. There is duplicate regulation are duplicate. A lot of regulation require too much time. You can reduce them by about 70% and get the same results. And then suddenly you have a lot of small companies. We have a professor in Berkeley that started a company called Mendel that was probably the biggest small company that developed traits. At the end, for a while, people thought that it was worth several billion. At the end, basically, couldn't do anything with the trait. It sold few to Monsanto because the regulatory process kills you. So why would anyone? So this guy was really good in getting in. Why would anyone invest in this type of technology? So the net effect, the society suffer from it, and in the long run, suddenly someone in China will figure it out, and it will be taken over. I really take a very strong approach, but that is the reality today. Now, if we look and say, what happened if GM would have adopted by all over the world in rice, corn, and wheat? The prices of, so we look at it, what happened if the rest of the world adopted corn. Price of corn will go down by, a price of corn will go down by about 20%, and the gain to society will be in several hundred of billions of dollars. I did it with wheat, I did it with rice, but if you look at it all together, the net effect of the social gain in terms of consumer and producers is in trillions. We have much more wheat, much more rice, much more corn, and in this case what happened, you use less land, you can use land for biofuel, and you can use land for the environment. So the losses that we have from this regulation already is hundreds of billions of dollars. And we don't speak about new trades that we have in the future. So basically today we have a situation that the main issue in GM, in my view, is there is incredible heavy regulatory system, tendency to make it more and more difficult, a social, basically people now, without any base of information, try to say, now you buy a banana that you don't have a GM banana and it's written no GM because it become a good trait. It's basically a situation that ignorance takes over our life and we pay a huge price, like I showed you before, billions of dollars. And basically, without GM and without taking advantage of modern biology, we wouldn't be able to understand biodiversity and protect it. What molecular biology allows you is to protect biodiversity. We wouldn't be able to invest in agriculture and use and move to the bioeconomy where you move away from non-renewable to renewable, because you can really use agriculture as base for almost all the products that you have. There is something called green chemistry. And if you use genetic engineering and biotechnology in general, you can move there. Otherwise, you cannot move there. You can move to a bio-based economy instead of a petroleum-based economy gradually. The ability to adapt to climate change will be compromised because we don't have much better tools to change crop system very much. Suppose within 10 years, suddenly the weather in San Francisco becomes the weather in Fresno, and the weather in Fresno becomes like the weather in Bakersfield. So you have movement of insects, you have a lot of problems, you need all the tools that you can have, but you couldn't have the best tools because of regulation. So to some extent, you will have incredible capacity to worry about the future. To me, if you worry about climate change, you have to love GMO. The other thing is that biotechnology is evolving. The reason, to me, GMO, we can survive without it. But there are all these other tools that are evolving. And there is now anti-science that will be against gene editing, against a lot of other things that come from molecular biology. That's what really is happening today, that people that basically are environmental basically develop technologies that are opposed to technologies that allow us to manage our environment better. So to some extent, GM, for example, will allow you to take advantage of robotics, allow you to take advantage to have much more refined farming, to have many varieties that you use in the field. So to some extent, we really have a little bit of a problem that it reduced our capacity to deal with some of the challenges of the future. What's going on here? Okay. So my main conclusion, if GM already under constraints allowed us to increase productivity, reduce prices, and improve environmental quality. But its potential is limited, it's being restricted, and I really think that by not taking advantage of our knowledge, we wouldn't be able to adapt to the future as well as we can. Thanks.
Time for some questions. If you hold up your hand.
More of a comment. I believe I read just the other day on the AAAS site that China now approved corn now that they've developed their own.
Yeah,
so your prediction's right on the money.
No, China really is a big importer of corn, so they would use it, yes.
Yeah.
But by the way, some of the best papers on the economic of GM were based in China, and actually a lot of the studies on the impact of GM were done in China when they used Monsanto varieties. So to some extent, there are many good papers in science that are based on Chinese data. All the data that I use on rice are based on data on rice. China developed some decent variety of rice using Monsanto technologies. But the moment they have their own technology, slowly they will introduce it.
Let's take another one here. Go ahead.
Why is the use of GM rice and wheat so restricted?
Oh, in my view, like this, okay. The use of wheat and rice, in my view, is restricted for two reasons. In wheat, I think that the wheat producers are really worried that the price of wheat will go down. Because the biggest player in wheat are the Canadian Wheat Board, are the Canadian, now they don't have the Wheat Board, and the North Dakota. And they opposed wheat because they were worried that the price will go down. Now they are supporting it, but in the meantime, there are all the European. The basic point is that the prices of wheat are not that high and producers are worried. Now, one reason that I think that there is a potential in the long run for biofuel, and already in the US biofuel is quite profitable. If you will have GM, you can convert more land. But to me, the big issue is not so much in the US or Europe. We will survive. It's in the developing countries. People in Africa cut the forest, starve, and they can use this technology and do much better. They can have their own food, they can have their own building. And to me, the only solution to deforestation is to reduce the requirement of agricultural production. Now, rice is the same story. But to me, if you take rice and you basically use GM rice, you can increase yield by 15 to 20%, and then you reduce acreage, and then you can grow sugarcane or other thing, and you basically make life much better in many developing countries.
The resistance is because they don't want the price to go down on rice?
That's one reason. This is more the economy story. The other thing is that we have huge pressure from environmental groups. Now, there is a politics. Generally in Europe, like suppose you have two parties. One party has 49%, another party has 49%, one party has 2%. The party with 2% generally this is an environmentalist. I give you, this is a true story. You know Sarkozy was the prime minister in France. He wanted to introduce GM because he realized, France would benefit from it. The environmentalist told him, you have two options. Either we will give you hell about nuclear power or about GM. Choose your poison. He said, okay, I'm against GM, so I can continue to use nuclear power.
Next week, we will hear from one of the world's leading conservationists, environmentalists, Peter Kariva, who is the head of the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, and for many years he was the senior vice president for research at the Nature Conservancy. So the environment will speak next week.
I was afraid you were talking about me. I think that the people who follow scientific data are definitely in favor of the GEs that are possible.
Yeah.
However, where there's a lot of non-scientific information now, and we are constrained by fear, would you say that some of this might be governed by religious beliefs?
Actually, my first paper, I'm originally from Israel. So what we did, I did an experiment. I asked people, okay, religious and non-religious, if they have two options. They have two types of chicken. One chicken was modified with hormones, and another chicken was modified with genetic modification. And you found that non-religious people would basically supported the genetic modification. Doesn't matter, Jews or Muslim, Arab, Muslim, Christian. Religious people were against genetic modification. So religious beliefs are very, very important. Now, the Pope actually had a big meeting about GM about 3 years ago. Not 3 years ago, gosh, it was 3 years ago, but 6 years ago. And the Vatican had a meeting, and they basically decided that it's not that bad after all. But altogether, of course, religious belief is affecting it. But to me, I think that I'm an environmental economist. I worked a lot with environmentalists to move water from agriculture to the environment. I was a person that really introduced a lot of the notion of payment for ecosystem services. So I did much more for environmental groups than Monsanto. But no, seriously. But the reality is that environmentalism is almost like a religion. And basically what happened with Greenpeace, they were able to have a campaign that was very important, and they basically, that was a big fundraiser, and they built their identity on it. So it's become a fight of egos here. It's that really what is really happening.
Let's
Now,
take
there is
another
also
one.
another thing. One thing.
Okay,
if you look at a company like All Foods, many of you buy an All Food, I'm sure. My wife buys an All Food. What does All Food as? So basically in All Food, what I find is that you take the price on Sefer, you multiply it by 2 and add another 10, and you get the same thing. Now why? They tell you, okay, they tell you that the tomatoes in Safeway are terrible because they are GM. There are no GM tomatoes. But the fact that they have a boogeyman, that they say, okay, you care for your health, so pay us twice as much and we will buy you healthy stuff. So to me, a lot of people take advantage of GM because it suddenly increases the value of their own tomatoes. This is a you look at it, all the chocolate, the expensive chocolate is no GM chocolate. There is no GM chocolate. So there is a lot of people that make good money from it, and to some extent, since the people that suffer are poor people in India, why not? That's my view. There is a lot of cynicism.
We have another question over here.
So this has been a really informative conversation. I really have enjoyed it. But I have a question about collateral damage, not so much about the GMO, but like if you're spraying Roundup, if you've got a crop that can handle the Roundup, but Roundup is still a very hazardous chemical that becomes airborne. And, you know, we've got cancer epidemic in this country like none other. And I wonder if some of this just isn't collateral damage.
Okay, now Roundup, let's put it this way. First, Roundup was introduced as a home gardening herbicide. And there is one thing clear about Roundup, it may have some problem, but it's not a carcinogen. I worked with EPA. The one thing they worry is about cancer. And Roundup was was benign. I don't think that there are a lot of other chemicals, like what? Atrazine. But I was working in a chemical, DBCP. DBCP was a chemical that was used in grapes. It was a fantastic chemical. It was 10 times better than Roundup. It was used in grapes and in other crops to do certain similar things at Roundup. You can use it during the season. It really increased yield. Then they discovered that it caused cancer. In 2 months, it was eliminated. So the point is this, it's not that the thing the EPA doesn't make a mistake, but Roundup has been around for a long time. It may have some side effects. Nothing don't have side effects, but it's not causing cancer. So the point is this, that obviously it's not perfect. Obviously not every application of GMO is error-free, but there is nothing in life that is error-free. What? No, so to some extent, compared to the alternative, is much better.
Other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to go to the back.
I just want to tack on. I want to tack on to your question. What about the pollinating insects?
Okay, that has nothing to do with GM. The pollinating insect. I work with a person with Claire Kremen, who is the biggest expert one of the biggest experts of pollination. Everyone said that they are the biggest expert, but she is a real expert. It's not, even she doesn't think that it's caused by GM. We really don't know what it is. The problem is this. If you're the thing about agriculture, that agriculture is basically, if you're an agricultural scientist, you're all the time at war. Like we have Pierce disease. How many of you heard about Pierce disease? It was a huge problem. People say, okay, tomorrow we won't have any grapes in California. People solve it. Basically, now we have a really big problem with oranges. It's called greening. If you don't solve greening, there will be no oranges. So the pollination thing, it's a huge problem. We don't know what caused it. I believe that at the end, GM may be a solution rather than the cause. There are much tougher chemicals and much tougher things that are happening. Now they think that it's because of a product that uses nicotine. But no one really proved it. So it's very easy to frighten people. But the point is this, the worst thing is to tell people something terrible is happening. Then you have the people that try to use a solution, and they say you cannot use the airplane, instead you have to hang on a bird. That's what really is happening today.
Other questions? We'll give you one more.
What effect, when they have more crop rotations, 2 and 3 crops a year, what has the impact been on the soil?
I'll give you an example. To me, the best area of California is Salinas. Salinas, they have 3 or 4 crop rotations. They basically replant it again and again and again and again and again. Now, in the Indus Valley, they are farming how many years? 1,000 years? Sustainable. China, whatever people say, they have relatively sustainable agriculture. They were able to keep 1 billion people. So they replant, so the soils are in good shape. Now, if you use heavy tractors and you have a lot of wind, you have a problem. One of the advantages of no tillage that it allows you to maintain the soil better, reduce soil erosion.
You both have mentioned that you can reduce the need for herbicides and pesticides with genetically engineered crops. Can you reduce the need for fertilizers?
To me, this is one of the biggest traits. The biggest trait that people were trying to do is nitrogen fixation. And I think there are some people in Davis that, yes, I'm not supposed to speak about it because I did the economic analysis of the potential for guys in Davis. Some people work on it and they believe that they will do it. And that will be one of the biggest applications.
Those of us who care about the ocean, one of the biggest effects of agriculture on the ocean is runoff of nutrients and over-fertilization of coastal waters, leading to some 400 plus dead zones around the world ocean. So that would be one we would be interested in. Are there other questions or comments? One more.
I'm kind of excited about this for Syria because Syria is an arid country. Only 5% of it receives rain, and the rest they rely on the Euphrates. And I think that could really help this country using your help me with that word, would you? The poly.
It's on your figure where you had the different ways of genetic engineering.
Yes, the polyploid. Yes, exactly. So yeah, I can see that helping the Syria. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment.
Now, if you look at Syria, they grow wheat. The yield of wheat in Syria about 2 tons per hectare. If they would use a GM variety, it can go easily to 3 or 3.5. So my feeling is that these are the countries that benefit much more from this technology.
You know, something we are very concerned here because if you look at UN projections, they say we'll need 70% more food by 2050, and right now we use a little over half the ice-free land surface to grow crops and livestock, and we use 70% of all the available water. So you can't simply scale up what we're doing today to feed another 3 to 4 billion people. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, I've heard people say, well, we shouldn't have another 2 or 3 billion people, but I've never heard them volunteer to be one of the ones that leaves.
Yeah, I think that you both, I want to thank both of you for a great introduction to the topic. It was really an excellent start to our course, and next week we're going to have 2 speakers, both of whom are on the current National Research Council study on genetically engineered crops. Peter Kariva, whom I mentioned, who is the director of the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, really one of the world's leading conservationists, and Neil Stewart from the University of Tennessee, and among his talents, in addition to being an expert on GMOs, he likes to deliver his lecture while playing a guitar. So it should be an interesting evening. Thank you all for coming, and thanks again to our 2 guests. And please, hand in that sheet. We want to see if, when you fill one in at the last class, whether you've changed your mind about anything. And there still may be some papaya over there. Let us know if you have any ill effects. Thank you very much for coming.